Picture Australia in the late 1840s. A vast sun-scorched land stretching endlessly in every direction, largely untouched by the ambitions that were reshaping the rest of the world. The British colonies clinging to its coastlines were quiet, almost sleepy places, where life moved to the slow rhythm of sheep grazing across golden plains and convict laborers breaking their backs under a relentless southern sun. Towns were small, populations were thin, and the future felt predictable, even unremarkable. Most colonists were simply trying to survive, bound to wool, agriculture, and the rigid social order imported from Britain. There was little to suggest that anything extraordinary lay ahead. Yet beneath the red soil and rocky creek beds of this ancient continent, something extraordinary was waiting. A single discovery was coming, one that would shatter the silence, upend every assumption, and permanently rewrite the destiny of an entire nation. Australia would never be the same again. The discovery that changed Australia forever did not happen by pure chance. In February 1851, Edward Hargreaves, a seasoned prospector, found gold near Bathurst in New South Wales at a site he named Ophir. But this moment was far from accidental. Hargreaves had recently returned from the California gold rush, where he had spent years learning how to read the land, identify gold-bearing rock formations, and use panning techniques refined by thousands of experienced prospectors. When he arrived back in Australia, the landscape looked immediately familiar to him. The rolling hills, the creek beds, the geological patterns all reminded him of California's goldfields. Armed with that knowledge, he knew exactly where to look and what to look for. Within days of searching, his instincts proved correct. That single find near Bathurst would set off a chain of events so powerful and so far-reaching that Australia would never be the same again. Word of Hargreaves' discovery at Bathurst did not stay quiet for long. Within days, newspapers across New South Wales blazed with headlines announcing gold in the hills, and the reaction was nothing short of explosive. Ordinary men and women who had spent their lives tending sheep, working trades, or running small businesses suddenly dropped everything. Shepherds abandoned their flocks in open fields. Shopkeepers locked their doors mid-morning. Farmhands walked off properties without a single word to their employers. The roads toward Bathurst became rivers of desperate, hopeful humanity, clogged with carts, horses, and people carrying whatever tools they could find. Employers could not keep workers. Businesses collapsed overnight. Colonial authorities watched in disbelief as entire communities seemed to dissolve before their eyes. Nothing in Australian colonial history had ever produced such immediate, widespread upheaval. A quiet land built on routine and order had suddenly been overtaken by something far more powerful than reason. The intoxicating promise of instant fortune. While New South Wales basked in its golden moment, an even more extraordinary chapter was unfolding just to the south. In 1851, gold was discovered in Victoria, and what followed would dwarf everything that came before. The regions around Ballarat and Bendigo revealed deposits of staggering richness, veins of gold running so deep and abundant that they seemed almost impossible to believe. Ballarat alone would eventually yield more gold than almost anywhere else on Earth, its soil hiding fortunes that would change countless lives forever. Bendigo proved equally magnificent, its golden reserves drawing gasps of disbelief from even the most seasoned prospectors. Word traveled fast, crossing oceans and continents with breathtaking speed. From the ports of London and Shanghai, from the hills of Ireland and the valleys of California, people heard the same electrifying message. Victoria was where destiny waited. These Victorian goldfields were rapidly becoming the beating heart of one of the extraordinary gold rushes the world had ever witnessed. The quiet pastoral society of sheep stations and government settlements was dissolving rapidly, replaced by something far more complex, vibrant, and unpredictable. Ships began arriving in Australian ports carrying thousands of hopeful migrants from every corner of the world. From the crowded streets of London and Dublin, from the villages of southern China, from the goldfields of California, and from across continental Europe, people packed their belongings and gambled everything on a new beginning. The numbers were staggering. In 1851, Australia's total population sat at roughly 400,000 people. By 1861, that figure had exploded to over 1 million. Nearly tripling within a single decade, this represented one of the most dramatic demographic transformations any continent had ever experienced. These newcomers did not simply add bodies to the landscape. They brought languages, traditions, foods, religions, and worldviews that collided and blended in ways colonial Australia had never imagined. Everyone was equal beneath the ground, united by the same desperate, burning hope that tomorrow's shovel might finally strike gold. The reality was raw, exhausting, and unrelenting. Miners lived in sprawling tent cities that stretched across hillsides turned inside out by thousands of shovels. When rain fell, which it often did, the ground became a thick, clinging mud that swallowed boots and flooded sleeping quarters. Men woke before dawn, worked until their hands bled, and collapsed into restless sleep with little to show for their efforts. Yet amid the hardship, something remarkable was happening. These chaotic camps were unlike anything the world had seen before. A former London clerk might spend his afternoon digging shoulder to shoulder with a Chinese merchant from Guangdong, while an Irish farmer worked the next claim over. Social hierarchies that had defined the old world simply dissolved in the dirt, planting seeds of exclusion that would eventually grow into the deeply troubling White Australia policy decades later, many traveling from Guangdong province seeking fortune and opportunity. By the mid-1850s, tens of thousands of Chinese miners had established themselves across Victoria and New South Wales, bringing disciplined work ethics and cooperative mining techniques that proved highly effective. However, their success bred deep resentment among European miners. Hostility escalated into outright violence, most notoriously during the Buckland River Riot of 1857 and the Lambing Flat Riots of 1860 and 61, where mobs attacked Chinese camps, destroying property, and driving people from their claims with brutal force. Colonial governments responded not by protecting Chinese miners, but by targeting them with discriminatory legislation. Alongside the physical hardships of goldfield life came a deeply resented political burden. Colonial authorities introduced a license fee system that required every miner to pay 30 shillings per month, regardless of whether they had found a single flake of gold. This meant a miner who had spent weeks digging through barren earth and earned nothing still owed the government the same amount as someone who had struck a rich vein. The fee was collected by mounted troopers who conducted aggressive license checks across the diggings, often treating miners with contempt and humiliation. For men who had traveled thousands of miles chasing opportunity, this felt like naked exploitation. They had no representation in colonial parliaments, no voice in the laws governing their lives, and no recourse against decisions made by distant officials who had never set foot on a goldfield. The anger this system generated was slow burning but dangerously intense, quietly uniting thousands of frustrated men around a common grievance. The call for resistance was no longer whispered but shouted openly across the goldfields. The relationship between miners and colonial authorities had deteriorated beyond repair, fueled by a series of events that shocked the goldfields community to its core. When a miner named James Scobie was murdered outside the Eureka Hotel, the owner, James Bentley, was controversially acquitted despite widespread belief in his guilt. Outraged miners burned the hotel to the ground in protest. Rather than addressing their legitimate grievances, authorities arrested the miners involved, deepening the sense of injustice. Meanwhile, license fee inspections continued with brutal regularity, with troopers conducting humiliating searches known as digger hunts, dragging men from their work and demanding papers. It represented ordinary people demanding dignity, representation, and justice from those who govern them. Miners gathered at Bakery Hill, swearing an oath beneath the newly raised Southern Cross flag, its white stars blazing against a deep blue background. Together, they constructed a rough wooden fortress called the Eureka Stockade, arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. On the 3rd of December, before dawn had fully broken, colonial troops and mounted police stormed the stockade. The battle lasted barely 30 minutes, but the violence was devastating. Around 22 miners and 6 soldiers died in the chaos. The rebellion was crushed swiftly and decisively. Yet something unexpected happened afterward. Rather than fading into obscurity, Eureka became a rallying cry. When the rebel leaders were put on trial, juries refused to convict them. The public's sympathy lay firmly with the miners. The Southern Cross flag had become something far greater than a symbol of defeat. The defeat at Eureka Stockade did not silence the miners. Instead, it ignited a political firestorm that forced colonial authorities to reckon with the deep injustices they had imposed. Within months of the battle, the hated license fee was abolished entirely, replaced by a far more affordable miner's right that cost just £1 per year. More remarkably, this miner's right came with something the miners had long demanded, the right to vote. For the first time, working men on the goldfields had a genuine political voice. The leaders of the rebellion were put on trial for high treason, but juries refused to convict them. A powerful signal of where public sympathy truly lay, historians widely regard Eureka as a watershed moment, a turning point that dramatically accelerated democratic reform not just in Victoria, but across all the Australian colonies, proving that ordinary people could challenge power and win meaningful change. The wealth pouring out of the goldfields did not simply fill private pockets, it fundamentally reshaped the physical and economic landscape of the Australian colonies in ways that would last for generations. Colonial governments, suddenly flush with gold-driven revenue, embarked on ambitious infrastructure programs that transformed the land almost beyond recognition. Railways stretched across previously isolated regions, connecting goldfields to ports and farmers to markets. Roads were carved through bushland, schools were built in growing towns, and grand public buildings rose from the earth with remarkable speed. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in Melbourne. Within just a few years, what had been a modest colonial settlement blossomed into one of the most spectacular cities in the southern hemisphere. Ornate banks, theaters, and government buildings lined its streets, reflecting enormous confidence and prosperity. The city earned the nickname Marvelous Melbourne, a title that captured the astonishing ambition of a place reborn through gold. It was becoming something far more complex, layered, and economically self-sufficient, capable of sustaining itself through multiple industries simultaneously. It ignited an entire ecosystem of economic activity that stretched well beyond the goldfields themselves. Miners needed to eat, so farmers expanded their operations, and food suppliers flooded the colonies with produce. They needed tools, so blacksmiths, ironworkers, and merchants built thriving businesses supplying picks, shovels, and pans. They needed clothing, shelter, and entertainment, so tailors, carpenters, and innkeepers prospered alongside the diggers. Towns that had never existed before sprang up overnight, each one demanding butchers, bakers, doctors, and lawyers. Supply chains grew longer and more sophisticated, connecting rural producers to urban markets in ways that wool farming alone had never required. This explosion of commercial activity fundamentally reshaped the Australian economy. For the first time, the colonies were developing genuine industrial and commercial diversity. The goldfields were quietly becoming the birthplace of a new national soul. When people from Britain, Ireland, China, America, Germany, and Italy dug side by side in the same muddy earth, something remarkable happened. Social hierarchies that defined the old world began to dissolve under the Australian sun. A man's worth was measured not by his birthplace or family name, but by his grit, his honesty, and his willingness to share hardship with his neighbors. This daily mixing of dozens of nationalities created an atmosphere unlike anything colonial Australia had previously known. Shared suffering and shared hope became powerful equalizers. Miners developed a culture of mutual reliance where helping a struggling neighbor was simply expected. Gradually, this experience began separating Australian identity from its British colonial roots. Something distinctly local was emerging, a spirit that was rougher, more direct, and deeply suspicious of privilege. While men dominated the popular image of the gold rush, women played an absolutely vital role in shaping goldfield communities. Far from being passive observers waiting at home, women arrived on the diggings and immediately carved out spaces of remarkable independence and influence. Many women ran boarding houses, laundries, bakeries, and small shops, generating income that often exceeded what their husbands earned from mining. In a cash-hungry economy desperate for services, female entrepreneurship thrived in ways that polite Victorian society back in Britain would never have permitted. Women also served as nurses and informal medical practitioners, tending to the sick and injured in communities where professional doctors were scarce and expensive. Some women even took up picks and pans themselves, working claims alongside men or independently. The goldfields created a social environment where survival mattered more than convention. This practical necessity quietly dismantled rigid gender boundaries, giving Australian women an early taste of economic agency and public life that would echo through generations to come. This chapter remains one of the Gold Rush era's most painful and unresolved legacies. For Aboriginal Australians, the Gold Rush was not a time of opportunity but of catastrophe. Lands that had been home to Indigenous communities for tens of thousands of years were suddenly overrun by hundreds of thousands of settlers who arrived without invitation, negotiation, or compensation. Sacred sites were torn apart by pickaxes. Rivers and waterways that sustained entire communities were poisoned and redirected. Traditional hunting grounds vanished beneath tent cities and mining operations almost overnight. The rapid influx of settlers dramatically accelerated the dispossession that colonial settlement had already begun, pushing Indigenous peoples further from their ancestral territories with brutal efficiency. Diseases including smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through communities that had no immunity, killing thousands. In Victoria and New South Wales, entire Aboriginal nations were devastated within a generation. The devastation suffered by Aboriginal Australians was not the only lasting consequence of the Gold Rush era. Across the colonies, something quieter but equally powerful was taking shape, a sense of shared identity. Men and women who had crossed oceans together, dug the same earth, endured the same hardships, and fought the same battles against unjust authority began to see themselves not merely as British subjects, but as Australians. The goldfields had created economic interdependence between colonies with trade, railways, and commerce weaving them into a single functioning web. The Eureka Stockade had given them a common democratic mythology. The struggles and triumphs were shared stories told around the same fires. By the 1890s, these threads were pulling tighter. politicians and ordinary citizens alike began asking why 6 separate colonies should remain divided. On the 1st of January 1901, they finally answered that question, and the Commonwealth of Australia was born. The gold rush didn't just transform Australia temporarily, it permanently rewired the nation's relationship with immigration and diversity. The migration patterns established during those frantic decades of the 1850s and beyond created templates that would echo through Australian history for generations. Chinese communities, despite enduring brutal discrimination, planted roots that grew into vibrant cultural contributions visible in every major Australian city today. European immigrants from Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe brought languages, cuisines, and traditions that gradually wove themselves into the Australian fabric. Their descendants became doctors, artists, politicians, and farmers, enriching every corner of national life. The gold rush essentially forced Australia to confront a fundamental question: what kind of nation would it become? While early answers were often shamefully exclusionary, as seen in the White Australia policy, the multicultural seeds planted on those muddy goldfields ultimately proved impossible to suppress. Modern Australia's celebrated diversity owes an undeniable and profound debt to those courageous immigrants who crossed oceans chasing golden dreams. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the gold rush was not the wealth it generated, but the values it planted deep within the Australian character. On the goldfields, where survival depended on cooperation and where a lucky strike could elevate anyone regardless of background, certain ideals took root and flourished. Mateship, the fierce loyalty between companions facing hardship together, became almost sacred. Egalitarianism emerged naturally in places where a duke and a ditch digger shared the same muddy tent. A deep distrust of authority, sharpened by corrupt officials and unjust license fees, became practically a national instinct. And the belief in a fair go, the idea that every person deserves an equal chance, echoed across generations long after the last nugget was found. These values did not disappear when the gold ran out. Today, Australians still invoke them, celebrate them in literature and sport, and sometimes argue fiercely about whether modern society truly honors them. The goldfields gave Australia its soul. Think back to that quiet colonial land before 1851, where sheep grazed across vast empty plains and the future seemed fixed and unchanging. Few could have imagined that a glint of gold in a New South Wales creek would shatter that stillness forever. Within a single generation, Australia transformed from a remote British outpost into a dynamic, diverse, and fiercely democratic nation. The goldfields became a crucible where immigrants, rebels, dreamers, and survivors were melted together and recast into something entirely new. The Eureka flag still flies as a symbol of that defiant spirit. The multicultural streets of modern Australian cities echo with the footsteps of those first fortune seekers. The values forged in the mud and hardship of Ballarat and Bendigo still pulse through the national character today. The gold rush was never merely an economic event, it was the moment modern Australia was truly born.